This is the July 18 edition of Commodity Week.
Todd Gleason services are made available to WILL by University of Illinois Extension.
Welcome to Commodity Week. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Brian Stark of the Andersons now joins us. He's here in Champaign County, does food-grade corn with Frito-Lay, and then works, of course, in Indiana as well with the ethanol plant in Logansport. Thank you so much. I know you spend a lot of time on the road. I appreciate it when you take time to talk to me. I wonder, just offhand, those two sides of your job, how very different is it to handle and think about the management of food grain and purchasing or procurement of that for Frito-Lay as opposed to the ethanol side, which is just generally number 2 yellow corn?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, it's a little bit different dichotomy when you're talking specialty versus number 2 yellow corn. But I think what we do for the customer, there's a lot of synergies in the risk management space. And part of the time over the years of getting the chance to talk to you along with other panelists you've hosted, I think that's kind of where the similarities of the connection between the two jobs are. You know, we're trying to help the farmer, the producer, manage his price risk, the risk management, so he can generate a profit, whether he's growing specialty corn or whether he's growing number 2 yellow corn for an ethanol plant or a commercial elevator. So I think even though the worlds are different at times, the different types that we're sourcing, it's certainly the same focal point of serving the customer and helping him manage his risk. And that's what I've been doing for 22 years in the grain business and what I enjoy doing. So that's why I guess I feel like the areas intertwined fairly well.
Well, it's interesting to think, and I had not included just the elevator in the system, but clearly you have access to the specialty crop, which is corn going into chips and food. You have access to the elevator, which is probably corn going into feed and maybe other places. And then on the ethanol side, or that Logansport facility, you're taking some of that grain coming into the elevator, and that's corn going into the gas tank. And it's just really a broad perspective of what this crop can do and does do across the whole of the economy.
Yeah, no, I think you eloquently summarized all the different demand usage categories that my role is fortunate enough to touch. Obviously, ethanol, the industrial usage, the food usage, and then also going into feed, turning into protein. So I think that's what makes it exciting about the job and the role I'm in today, is that it is vastly different day to day on which one kind of sits at the top of the focal point. But I think the ability to have a pulse on the different demand factors is important when you're talking to any of those customers, whether it be the ethanol plant in Logansport or Delphi, Indiana, where the elevator is, versus Frito-Lay helping them originate corn into their facility in Sydney. So I think those customers all can feel the sense that you're tied into the different demand factors, the fundamentals that influence our market, and have a good baseline to help guide their risk management decisions when it comes to marketing their grain. And obviously this year is certainly provided to be a challenging one, given the fundamentals, at least from how the market is looking at the current balance sheet as well as the crop that we're growing here in the Corn Belt.
I'm going to stay with you for just a minute and delve into your experience as it's related to ethanol, because you've been doing this for 22 years with the Andersons, and ethanol has been in part of that experience the whole of the time, early in the development of the current 10% ethanol blends. The ramp up, how much different is today's market for corn and ethanol? I'm going to guess very steady in the amount compared to those very first years in 06, 7, 8.
Yeah, I would say you summarized that well. It's very steady. It's very we've, I guess, reached the infamous blend wall at the 10% blend you referenced. I think the opportunities to expand the demand base is a little more methodical because it's driven based on potentially E15 or export. And so early on in '06, '07, '08, when we were ramping up with the policy that President Bush kind of crafted, there was a lot bigger demand or pull, and that's part of the reason why corn went to $8 for the first time during that time period. And now we've kind of balance that demand base where it's more of a steady influence that grows incrementally versus a big ramp up at the beginning. So you could say it's seasoned, by now, going back the past not quite 20 years, 17, 18 years, and certainly looking for new avenues and demand bases to offset what we assume is going to continue to be improving genetics, improving yield potential over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And obviously that's what the market needs right now to, I guess, stabilize and give some renewed upside opportunities is an increasing demand. And where is that potentially going to come from? Is it ethanol? Most likely it's more of going to be a steady influence. It is going to have to be in another category. Export could be one, but we also know we're in a very competitive world market now. It's not just the U.S. balance sheet anymore. It's a world balance sheet. We have to consider some of the competition, and then certainly, last but not least, your feed usage category. Where are we going to continue to see animal numbers go up, and is that a good growth opportunity? Or, box number 4, is there another potential future use of corn demand that could potentially that hasn't been mentioned or discovered yet for usage, add to the equation, similar to what ethanol did in '06, '07, '08.
Essentially, it's a mature market from the ag econ side, and you would have learned this, I know, at the University of Illinois as you came through college there.
Yes, yeah, no, it's. I was fortunate enough to spend time under two illustrious professors that I have much respect for, Dr. Darrell Good and Dr. Scott Irwin, and spent 6 years at the university and got my master's degree, and certainly learned a lot of insightful information, and still love the connection that I have with the farmdoc team.
Why is it that 12% blend rather than 15% blend hasn't been pushed along? Because the 12% blend could just stay in the 10% blend wall area if they wanted. I think, and EPA has said it's okay for all vehicles, as opposed to the 15% blend, which means you can't use it in anything that's older than 2000.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but I certainly think you made a good point that could be another avenue to incrementally grow demand quicker on the ethanol space. But for whatever reason, the focal point has been trying to get year-round E15 demand, and there is limitations based on the car's age, and maybe the expectation is the focal point of why they're focused on E15 is that the natural phase out of some of the older cars will naturally occur at a quicker pace here over the next 3 to 5 years, that maybe that's no longer a concern as far as usage goes. But certainly something worth discussing as time goes on, as we look for that next incremental demand to offset growing production and genetics.
Now let's talk about the marketplace straight up. We'll stay with corn. Farmers have old crop corn more than they should, they know. And now they're really faced with decisions as we go into the latter part of July as to what they should do with this.
Yeah, I think that's a real tough question. Obviously, the market has not given us those seasonal rallies because we've had such good growing conditions up to this point across most of the Corn Belt. Every year you have spots that unfortunately have adverse conditions, but as a whole, it feels like we're trading a much bigger crop than what the government's certainly printing today at 181. And I think, it's always hard for the producer to come to the realization that the upside target or the price targets that they established may not be necessarily in the cards. And I think from a risk management perspective, now's the time where you have to kind of reassess and say, all right, do I really want to be long two crops, knowing that most producers today aren't probably more than a quarter to a third sold on new, this crop they're going to harvest this fall. Do I want to continue to stay long those bushels on both crops, hoping that there's a potential rally down the road where it feels like today isn't going to be in the cards. I will point out, though, one of the things I would note is that a lot of market analysts have pointed out that very similar price pattern in 2024 in the calendar year to what we saw in the Deese 2014 contract. And in that year, our low was established around the end of September, and we had a counter-seasonal rally through the month of October. And I think, not to say that we should carry, again, two crops into fall, but I would say to the producers that are listening that there is still the opportunity that we will form a bottom, and it may form earlier than the normal harvest time frame this year simply because of the fund composition. So moral of the story in wrapping that all up is that I think the producer on any type of small rally needs to be looking to liquidate his old crop stocks, as painful as that decision may be, and then look for an opportunity on a scale-up basis if we see a counter-seasonal rally this fall because of the fund composition and wanting to maybe balance out their short position to take advantage of that and establish floors on their new crop production.
Did you go back, and I suspect this is not the case, to see what the ending stocks for the fourth quarter were in 2014 and whether there were any major adjustments? And I ask this simply because in this last WASDE, USDA added consumption in 150 million bushels, 75 and 75 for feed and ethanol in the old crop, and added more as well in the new crop. Based on the lower price for new crop, I know, but I'm wondering whether there were adjustments then that caused that potential jump once we got to September.
That's a great question. I have not had a chance to go back and look. It's certainly been on the list of mine because, as you pointed out, they surprised the trade here last Friday by taking the demand factors up when the quarterly stocks numbers would argue that it would have went the other way. And either they have a forecasted large feed usage expected in the fourth quarter, or some may say that maybe that's a sign that we potentially overestimated last year's crop size. Time will tell when we get to September 30th, when we see the final quarterly stocks. But I think going back and looking at that period would certainly be helpful to understanding why we had that seasonal rally. Otherwise, the charts do compare very similarly to what we saw back in 14.
Any assessment of the soybean market at this time?
I think the biggest thing with soybeans, any old crop beans, there's certainly a hot cash market today. Crush margins are still very good. The beans tend to be in short supply, even though the overall board price has come down. Spread action is kind of tried to incent some of that spot needed demand. And so I would at least at minimum look at locking in basis while the market's willing to pay up for any old crop beans unpriced on the farm. When it comes to new crop, I think, again, similar to corn, we have to look at opportunities to establish floors. I think the bean market still has a chance, given the bean crops generally made in August, to see some seasonal rallies if we see any adverse conditions. So while corn is a little tougher to address, there certainly seems to be a little more optimism on the soybean side, simply because we did plant less acres than initially intended. Certainly haven't had all of the acreage accounted for from a planting perspective, given where that survey occurred at the beginning of June, and we still had quite a few acres that were remaining unplanted at that time. So I think the bean balance sheet certainly has some risk and gives us a little upside potential, more so than corn does currently. So a defensive posture on corn, and I think producers can be a little patient on the soybean side.
And finally, what route do you travel between Champaign County and Logansport, and how has that route changed over the last 2 months, other than, crops getting a lot bigger, but just in condition?
So I generally come across 74 until I get to the Attica exit,
Uh-huh.
which is 41, and I go north and cut through the country over country roads between there and the south side of Lafayette. And I would say, as a whole, over the last 2 months, the crop looks very, very good. The one thing I'll point out, and I'm sure it's been highlighted by many people you've talked to over the last couple of months, is that the crop is highly variable, and that's to be expected given the planting dates and how extended the planting season was. But overall, things look very good. I will say the Indiana side of the state line of the area I travel has had a little more water, so there's a little more drowned out spots than what we see on the Illinois side that I travel. But overall, very similar conditions. Crop looks in excellent shape, other than the fact that you've got corn fully pollinated all the way to corn just starting to tassel.
You're actually the first one who's pointed that out, and I've not talked about it on the air, but just knowing how long and traveling myself, seeing the variability in the size of this crop in terms of height and how far along it is. I'm wondering whether that is a good or a bad thing, because oftentimes the whole of the Corn Belt, and by the whole of the Corn Belt, I mean everything, is planted in a 2.5 week period. It just goes in, or seems to be. It's just really fast, and it all matures at the same time. It all goes through pollination at the same time. It hasn't all been caught very often during pollination in a bad moment, but whether that variability will be a good thing or a bad thing this year, I wonder about.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, harvest could be last 4 to 6 weeks, describing what you just said with a quick planting season, or it could be 6 to 8 weeks. And I think obviously it leans the latter. I think what's amazing about this weather pattern we've experienced as a whole, outside of the few extremes that we referenced at the beginning in certain areas of the northwest part of the Corn Belt, overall, the variability would argue there's more chances to do detrimental weather during the growing season, and we really haven't seen that across the spectrum.
Right.
There's certainly been hot temperatures, but it's come with rain or timely rain in most spots. And I think that's what's interesting to me, that even though the crop is extremely variable, it hasn't really had adverse conditions enough weather-wise to impact that variability yet. And obviously we're running out of time for that to happen.
When was the last time that you recall in your 22 years, and there may not be one, although there were some really wet years, where we drug a harvest out? And what does that do to basis and the ability of grain elevators to handle a crop?
Well, there's 2 years that stick out to me in my tenure in my grain business career, one being 2009, the other 2019. And both those years saw cool, wetter summers, and 2009 was probably the most extreme, where the crop never really naturally dried down in the field, and the driest corn was in the low 20s. And that harvest went from the middle of September all the way to the first week of January. I don't think we're in that type of scenario with the variability this year. That's probably the extreme. But certainly over the course of time, I don't know if it was so much impact on basis as it was available dryer capacity for the facilities to handle grain, where facilities were open half days instead of full days, 12-hour days during those time frames. And I think that's the one impact. Logistically, it has more impact, maybe more so than impact to basis, when you have that type of variability.
Yeah, that variability. I wonder if that variability that you're talking about is based on the cool, wet, and it just didn't dry down because it stayed wet, right? I think.
Right. Right.
I mean, it stayed wet, not just the crop, but it just stayed wet in those years, if I remember right.
Yes.
But if we were to have a dry fall, you might not have that issue.
Yeah, I would say it really just depends on if you have a dry finish to the season and you maintain some warmth, the crop will catch up and narrow the gap of that variability. So I think in order for you to really have an elongated harvest like those 2 years I referenced, you have to have cooler finishing temperatures where the crop, just stays healthier longer, never really naturally dries down, and then that tends to elongate harvest because of logistics handling it more so than the lack of maturity or spread out nature of the maturity of the crop from its planting stage.
Yeah, so your assessment, though, was roughly speaking, did not impact price. I mean, roughly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it just kept it kept the dryers running and elevators shut down to keep the dryers caught up. Interesting.
Because generally a function of basis is space related, and in those 2 years it was dryer capacity related, right? It wasn't a space function, and generally when you have a big crop and space is having a hard time handling it, that has a negative impact to basis. In those years, looking back, it really wasn't as impactful other than the hours the facilities could be open simply because they could only get so far behind the dryer before they'd have to pause and catch up.
How about in the big years like 14?
14, I think, it had some negative impact. I'd have to go back and look at basis. I'm testing my memory going back 10 years, but I certainly think that, basis, it functions as space, but also lack of demand. And I think logistically back then it's both. And I think that's certainly, if I had to give a prognostication, I guess, on this fall, given what we expect the crop size to be and the fact that there's so much stocks sitting on farm record in Illinois and Indiana for this time of the year, there's an impact to space and the lack of demand on the corn side specifically that, if you don't feel the basis pressure prior to new crop in that old crop, new crop transition, you will probably see it impacted negatively when we get to October under above normal crop circumstances in production. So I do think basis does have some risk to the downside as we get closer to fall on the new crop side.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, because this is kind of a new reckoning where we built a great deal of on-farm capacity. What we had thought of, and at first I had a lot of questions coming back at me was, well, we don't have any ground piles. I was like, well, we don't have ground piles because everybody built a bin and they got picked up. But when we would have ground piles, then we would talk about that second harvest. And we just delayed the second harvest until now and August. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that it's not just. I think that's a great point to for the listeners to consider. We've been disappointed in the action of the futures here during the calendar year of this crop, but there's another, I guess, double-edged sword, so to speak, that could come at some point in time. Nobody knows when, but when those stocks finally move, there's going to be some added bearishness on basis. So not only is the board price lower, there's risk to the downside with the basis component of the cash price.
Can I ask you about one last thing? We've almost made a full Commodity Week program, so we may as well do it. Renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. From your contacts within the organization, what are they telling you out of the Marathon Oil side about SAF and renewable diesel?
That's a great question, and probably not one I'm the best expert in. I think certainly that is a focal point in of where I guess, I personally think demand is going, but certainly has reached some roadblocks, so to speak, from the oil side of the spectrum. But I certainly think that the quickest way to get there, from our end of the spectrum, would be to continue to look at not just renewable diesel from oil products like soybean oil, but certainly from the ethanol side of the equation as well. So I think there's opportunity for demand base to grow. The question I have as I think about it is, which feedstock is going to be the best producer of that as we go forward, if that's truly the objective of the airlines to focal point on that. And obviously California has a lot to do with the direction of how big that demand looks here moving forward. So a lot of unknowns, I guess, more so than known today on what the future, if that's really going to be a strong demand base for beans and or corn here down the road, but certainly something that we need to keep an eye on as we proceed forward.
And have you heard, and because I had been to at least one and more than one conference over the wintertime, one specifically on sustainable aviation fuel, where the airline industries were represented at the executive level. And I heard earlier in this week we had Jeff Cooper on from the Renewable Fuels Association, and I said to him that they're all in, and they're all in because they can market to their customers, and other reasons, I suppose. But it's something that they can market to the customers, that we're sustainable aviation fuel. Marquis, I think that's the right one, I believe serves O'Hare. And what I came to believe out of those conferences this winter, at least the one, was that Chicago, if you have a plant, an ethanol plant, near or with a pipeline to the major hub, so Atlanta, Chicago, Minneapolis, Moline, or Minneapolis, St. Paul. Sorry, I'm driving a tractor. That provides a big space, and there's an awful lot of demand there, more than we could probably meet. But to begin with, it should drive things pretty quickly, I would guess. But it is logistics for that particular product, getting it from one space to the other very quickly.
It is, and I think what you've probably read and most listeners probably seen is, pipelines, and being able to pipe it and move it to where it is, and be efficient with from the plant to the airlines, and what does that look like across the Corn Belt, and where can we efficiently execute that demand. And again, I think it's its infancy stage, so it's really hard to comment on. It feels like it's a positive potentially today, but time will tell if it can be efficient, because there's a lot of things we can go back and talk about cellulosic and how that, the handling, the logistics of that kind of fell to the wayside. And I think, not to say that these two are intertwined or similar in nature, but I think the unknowns of how it gets executed is what makes it tough to think, what the demand's going to look like here moving forward for our industry, and to serve that potentially robust demand over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
On the pipelines note, I was in St. Louis at the Danforth Plant Sciences Center on Monday night of this week, and there was a panel discussion related to the ports there, the terminals there. They call the Ag Coast, the 15 miles that is centered on St. Louis, where rail and truck and barges move all kinds of things for our purposes: grains, oil seeds, and fertilizer coming back up, cement too. And the person who is in charge of marketing for the area was outlining just what was the most efficient. And so you and I know full well that barges are the most efficient out of that crew, or at least we thought, or at least that's what I was thinking. And he said trucks, and then trains, and then the barges. And he asked what the most efficient was, and it's pipelines, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Pipelines.
Yeah, pipelines. Yeah, that makes sense for sure.
Indeed. Well, thank you for spending so very much time with me today. I really, really do appreciate it.
My pleasure, Todd. Always a good time talking to you.
That's Brian Stark. He is with the Andersons. Joined us here on Commodity Week. You can always listen to it again if you'd like on our website at willag.org. That's WILLAG.org, where right now you can register for next week's Commodity Week program to be reported live in Western Illinois at the Illinois Soybean Association's Tailgate Talk. Registration information is on our website in the calendar of events. It's in red. Click that, open it up, and then hit details, and all the links will be hot. I hope you will come visit us in Augusta Thursday at 4 o'clock, and then enjoy the meal, courtesy of the Soybean Association, and listen to our panelists, including Matt Bennett, Kurt Kimmel, and Merrill Crowley. I'm Todd Gleason.